April 7, 1945, Tokyo Bay, Empire of Japan. As dawn breaks over the Japanese home islands, 91 North American P-51D Mustangs from the 15th and 21st Fighter Groups approach their meeting point. Inside his Mustang, Major James B. Tapp tightly grips the control stick. His 6 wing-mounted 0.50 caliber M2 Browning machine guns are loaded with armor-piercing incendiary rounds. The early model P-51Ds carry 500 rounds for each inboard gun and 270 for the center and outboard positions, totaling 2,080 rounds. Later models would lower this to 400 rounds per inboard gun for better reliability, bringing the total to 1,880 rounds. Below, Mount Fuji rises proudly against the clear morning sky, an unmistakable landmark that pilots would reference throughout the mission. The morning sun casts long shadows over the Japanese landscape, revealing a patchwork of rice fields, villages, and military installations that had never encountered American fighters before. Single-engine American fighters over Tokyo, something their commanders had insisted could never happen. The psychological impact is immediate and devastating. These aren't carrier-based Navy fighters with limited range, but land-based Army Air Force fighters that have somehow crossed 750 miles of open ocean to reach the imperial capital. Leading the Japanese defense are pilots flying the Nakajima Ki-84 Hayate, the Frank, Japan's fastest and most advanced fighter, alongside older Ki-43s, Ki-44 Shokis, Ki-61 Hyans, and N-1 K-2-J Sherdens. The Ki-84 was capable of outclimbing and outmaneuvering both the P-51 and the Republic P-47 Thunderbolt at specific altitudes and speeds. What unfolds next will illustrate the significant technological divide between the two nations' strategies for air combat and explain why American industrial strength led to the creation of what many pilots would describe as the ideal long-range fighter aircraft. The North American P-51D Mustang entered the Pacific theater with a reputation already established over Europe, where it had significantly weakened the Luftwaffe and enabled daylight bombing missions over Germany. Originally developed for export to Britain, the models modified by the British to incorporate Rolls-Royce Merlin engines evolved into America's most effective wartime fighters. The shift from the Allison-powered early versions to the Merlin-powered Marvel marked one of aviation's most fruitful international partnerships, combining American aerodynamic ingenuity with British engine expertise. The combination of the iconic Merlin engine and the P-51 Mustang ultimately led to the creation of the P-51D, which equipped the U.S. Army Air Forces with a high-performance, high-altitude, long-range fighter capable of escorting heavy bombers all the way to Berlin and back, and astonishingly, from Iwo Jima to Tokyo and back. The Packard 51650-7 engine, a licensed version of the Rolls-Royce Merlin 66, produced 1,695 horsepower at takeoff with water injection, increasing to 1,720 horsepower in emergency war power settings. This two-stage, two-speed supercharged engine maintained exceptional performance at altitudes where Japanese engines struggled for air, as their single-stage superchargers couldn't compress the thin atmosphere adequately. The P-51D could reach a maximum speed of approximately 440 miles per hour at 25,000 feet, achieved an operational ceiling of nearly 42,000 feet, and was equipped with 6 0.50-inch M2 Browning machine guns mounted on its wings. The firepower calculations were both devastating and meticulously precise. 6 M2 Browning machine guns firing at a rate of 800 rounds per minute meant that the P-51D could unleash 4,800 rounds of concentrated firepower every minute, or 80 rounds every second. Each armor-piercing round weighed 46 grams and traveled at 2,900 feet per second, delivering immense kinetic energy upon impact, capable of penetrating aircraft armor, igniting fuel tanks, and crippling engines with just a few accurately placed shots. By late 1944, 14 out of the 15 fighter squadrons of the U.S. 8th Air Force in Europe were equipped with Mustangs, highlighting the aircraft's dominance over all other fighters at the time. This extensive production and deployment showcased American industrial power at its height, with assembly lines operating around the clock, 7 days a week. North American Aviation's factories in Inglewood, California, and Dallas, Texas, were churning out P-51s at an astonishing rate. During peak production, a new Mustang was completed every hour on the assembly line. By the end of the war, a total of 15,586 P-51s in various models were built, with the D model alone making up 8,156 of those, surpassing Japan's total output of all fighter types in the last 2 years of the conflict combined. The long-range capabilities that allowed Mustangs to reach Tokyo marked a revolutionary shift in fighter operations, fundamentally altering the strategies of air warfare. Equipped with dual 110-gallon drop tanks, Mustangs regularly achieved round trips of 1,500 statute miles, with pilots sometimes extending this to 1,600 miles when needed. This distance is comparable to flying from Los Angeles to Little Rock, Arkansas, entirely over water in a single-engine plane, with the ocean as the only possible landing area. The success of this feat was largely due to the Merlin engine's remarkable fuel efficiency at cruising speed, consuming just 65 gallons per hour at an economical cruise, along with the P-51's laminar flow-wing design, which reduced drag by 35% compared to traditional airfoils. The laminar flow wing, created by North American aerodynamicist Edgar Schmaud, ensured smooth airflow over a larger portion of the wing's surface, delaying the shift to turbulent flow and significantly cutting down on drag. In sharp contrast was the Nakajima Ki-84 Hayate, which began service with the Imperial Japanese Army Air Service in June 1944, arriving too late and in insufficient numbers to change the war's direction. Known as Gale and labeled Frank by the Allies, this fighter symbolized Japan's urgent attempt to rival American technological dominance with the limited resources left to the beleaguered empire. The Ki-84 is typically regarded as the best Japanese fighter produced in significant quantities during the war. However, what Japan viewed as mass production, the US would classify as prototype runs. The aircraft featured impressive speed and agility, armed with up to 230mm H-155 cannons and 220mm H-5 cannons, giving it substantial firepower on paper. The situation was more nuanced. The 30mm cannons were limited to just 50 rounds each, while the 20mm cannons had only 150 rounds per gun, totaling a mere 400 rounds compared to the Mustang's impressive 1,880 to 2,080 rounds. On paper, the Ki-84 looked competitive and even superior in certain areas. It was equipped with the Nakajima Ha-45 Homa 18-cylinder radial engine, a sophisticated system featuring fuel injection and a single-stage 2-speed supercharger, which utilized water methanol injection to boost the supercharger, allowing the Ki-84 to generate a rated 2,000 horsepower upon takeoff. Early tests were promising, with prototypes achieving speeds of 387 miles per hour in level flight, and later claims suggested speeds of up to 427 miles per hour under optimal conditions with high-octane fuel and precise engine tuning. However, the reality of Japanese production in the late war presented a starkly different picture, characterized by declining quality, frantic improvisation, and systemic failures. Pilots and crews in the field learned to handle the Nakajima Hama engine and landing gear with care, as both were prone to critical failures at the worst times. Although the Hama engine was theoretically powerful and advanced, it faced ongoing reliability issues that grew worse as quality control declined. The engine demanded precise tolerances that Japanese factories, constantly under B-29 bombardment and lacking quality steel and aluminum, could no longer uphold. Many landing gear units were compromised due to the poor heat treatment of late-war Japanese steel, which often contained impurities that hindered proper hardening. Consequently, many high-altitude aircraft experienced strut collapses during landing, resulting in losses of planes that Japan could ill afford and the deaths of pilots who had undergone months of training. The inconsistency in production quality mirrored the larger industrial crisis confronting Japan, a nation that had staked everything on a quick victory and ultimately failed. While American factories upheld consistent quality standards even with high production volumes, and actually enhanced quality as production methods improved, Japanese manufacturing saw a sharp decline. This gradual drop in quality control left pilots uncertain about how individual aircraft would perform, whether the brakes would function, if the engine could withstand high power settings, and even if they could climb high enough to intercept B-29 Superfortresses flying at 30,000 feet. By 1945, Japan had produced only 3,514 Ki-84s in total, with many grounded due to shortages of spare parts, fuel, or qualified pilots. Of those that were operational, only about half could be deemed truly combat-ready at any time. The fuel crisis highlighted the strategic disaster Japan faced, a country that had entered the war partly to secure oil resources. While American pilots used 100-octane aviation gasoline from refineries in Texas and California, designed for high-performance engines, Japanese pilots had to rely on whatever fuel could be produced locally or made from coal. By the end of the war, Japanese aviation fuel frequently measured at 87 octane or lower, sometimes dropping to as low as 80 octane, which diminished engine power and caused pre-ignition that damaged cylinders, pistons, and valves. In a desperate attempt to improve their fuel, some units added pine root oil from pine stumps, alcohol distilled from sweet potatoes, and even byproducts from sake production, which further compromised engine performance and reliability. Pilots reported engines that struggled to start, ran poorly at all power levels, and often failed dramatically in the air. On that initial mission on April 7, the Mustangs joined up with their charges, 103 Boeing B-29 Super Fortresses from the 73rd Bomb Wing, each loaded with tons of incendiary bombs aimed at Japanese industrial sites. Captain Art Bridge of the 45th Fighter Squadron remembered it as a remarkable sight. The 29th was just completing their formation in a large circle as we arrived. The sun reflected off their aluminum surfaces, making them appear like a school of massive silver fish gliding through the sky. The meeting itself showcased a success in navigation and planning that could not have happened without American technological superiority. The P-51s had flown 750 miles over open ocean, primarily relying on dead reckoning and a basic radio compass, timing their arrival to align with the bomber's schedule within minutes. They had gradually ascended from sea level to 25,000 feet, with their engines automatically adjusting the mixture as they climbed and their superchargers smoothly switching from low to high blower to maintain power. Upon reaching the coast of Honshu, the P-51 pilots discarded their 110-gallon auxiliary wing tanks as they began to notice the first head-on feints from over 100 Japanese interceptors scrambling from various airfields around Tokyo. The silver tanks plummeted to the ground, sparkling in the morning sunlight, with some exploding upon impact while others bounced across the rice fields. The Japanese pilots, flying a mix of Ki-84s, K-43s, K-44s, K-61s, and Navy fighters, including Zeros and the new N-1K2J Shirdenkai, were hit with their first wave of shock. These were not Navy carrier fighters with limited range, they were land-based fighters that somehow made it to the homeland from bases they believed were far too distant. Flight Sergeant Takeshitani Mizu, piloting a Ki-84 with the 56th Sentai, later reflected on his disbelief. When we were scrambled, we were informed that enemy fighters were on their way to Tokyo. We assumed it was a mistake, maybe they meant enemy bombers. When I saw the Mustangs up close, I thought I was dreaming. It couldn't be real. Our commanders had assured us that no American fighter could reach Japan from their island bases, yet there they were, dozens of them, flying as if they owned our skies. At that moment, I realized the war was truly lost. Major James B. Tapp, who would later become an ace with 8 confirmed kills, was among the first Mustang pilots to dive into a group of Japanese fighters. His combat report, written just hours after the mission, outlined the encounter with remarkable clarity. They approached us in the usual 3-plane Shotai formation, but their coordination was lacking. The flight leader would launch an attack, yet his wingmen often failed to follow up. They appeared hesitant, possibly low on fuel or ammunition, or just inexperienced. We swooped in with a 100-mile-per-hour speed advantage, fired quick bursts, and climbed back up to altitude before they could respond. This failure in Japanese tactical coordination highlighted the severe crisis in pilot training that had reached disastrous levels. By 1945, most skilled Japanese pilots were dead, having been killed over the Solomon Islands, New Guinea, the Philippines, or during the Marianas Turkey shoot. Replacements had as little as 50 hours of flight training before being sent into combat, while American pilots typically received 600 hours before heading to battle zones. When the smoke settled and the Mustangs returned to their Iwo Jima base, the 7th Fighter Command Sunsetters were credited with destroying 26 Japanese planes, with 1 more probable and 5 damaged, at the cost of 2 P-51s and 1 pilot. The 13-to-1 kill ratio from this initial mission would only improve as American pilots gained experience over Japan, while the quality of Japanese pilots continued to decline. In just a few weeks, kill ratios of 20-to-1 or even 30-to-1 would become the norm, highlighting not only American superiority but also the desperation of the Japanese. The performance gap between the aircraft became strikingly evident in combat, especially in the vertical dimension where air battles were increasingly fought. The P-51D's dominance became especially clear at altitudes over 20,000 feet, where the majority of interceptions occurred. At these heights, the Merlin engine's 2-stage supercharger delivered sea-level power, while Japanese engines struggled. The first stage compressed the thin air, cooled it via an intercooler, and then sent it to the second stage for additional compression, supplying the cylinders with dense, oxygen-rich air. In contrast, the Ki-84's single-stage supercharger, without an intercooler or second stage, led to a significant loss of power above 20,000 feet, diminishing its speed advantage and climb rate right where interceptions typically happened. At 30,000 feet, the Ki-84 could barely hold 350 miles per hour, whereas the P-51D could still reach 420 miles per hour. Lieutenant Jerry Yellin of the 78th Fighter Squadron, who flew the last combat mission of the war on August 14, 1945, or August 15 in Japan, recounted a typical engagement with striking detail. "We'd see them climbing up to altitude, leaving dark trails of exhaust as they pushed their throttles to the limit, but by 25,000 feet, they were floundering like fish out of water. Their engines were smoking, likely running too rich since their superchargers couldn't supply enough air. We would dive through their formation with our 650s firing, the tracers appearing like laser beams, and they simply couldn't keep up with our speed in the dive or our climb afterward. Our Merlins would roar as we pulled up, G-forces pressing us into our seats, while their radials would cough and sputter, struggling to stay powered. The P-51D could dive at speeds nearing 500 miles per hour while still maintaining control. Its laminar flow wings remained efficient even in the transonic range, while Japanese fighters often faced control reversals or structural failures at speeds over 400 miles per hour during a dive. Their control surfaces malfunctioned, or their wings simply ripped away. The disparity in pilot skill was stark and worsened as time went on. American pilots arriving at Iwo Jima usually had between 400 and 600 flight hours, including over 100 hours in their specific aircraft, numerous hours of gunnery practice, and comprehensive combat training against seasoned instructors flying captured enemy planes or precise simulations. They had drilled formation flying until it became instinctual, navigated by instruments in all weather conditions, practiced deflection shooting at towed targets, and employed combat tactics refined over 3 years of air warfare experience. In contrast, Japanese pilots in 1945 frequently had fewer than 100 total flight hours, sometimes as few as 30 hours, with limited gunnery practice due to a lack of ammunition, no instrument training, and combat tactics learned from manuals instead of from experienced instructors, most of whom were either dead or engaged in combat missions themselves. The navigation challenge alone distinguished the skilled from the doomed, the living from the soon-to-be dead. Piloting single-engine fighters on 1,500-mile round trips across a vast ocean with limited navigation tools demanded confidence built on experience and trust in both the aircraft and support systems. American pilots operated with comprehensive weather briefings sourced from submarine reports and reconnaissance flights, precise maps updated through photo intelligence, and reliable instruments made to exact specifications. They had rescue submarines positioned along their route, lifeguard submarines that saved many downed airmen, and could depend on Dumbo, PBY, and Catalina flying boats for additional rescue if necessary. In contrast, Japanese pilots often used outdated maps that failed to reflect recent bomb damage, unreliable compasses that hadn't been properly calibrated, and faced no chance of rescue if they went down over water. Their life rafts, if they had any at all, often leaked, and their emergency supplies were typically depleted during food shortages on land. In 1945, the magnetic variation between EWO and Tokyo was 3 degrees west. Since Tokyo was positioned between the 139th and 140th meridians, while EWO was between the 141st and 142nd, navigation for the return flight was simplified to basic compass directions, a fortunate geographic coincidence that saved many American lives. This coincidence became vital when weather conditions worsened or pilots lost their bearings in combat, with their compasses spinning erratically as they maneuvered. A pilot could simply head south-southeast, knowing he would eventually spot Iwo Jima's iconic Mount Suribachi rising from the sea, provided he had enough fuel. The logistics behind each force highlighted the true nature of the Pacific Air War, a struggle between American abundance and Japanese scarcity. Each mission from Iwo Jima involved nearly 100 Mustangs, using up 57,000 gallons of high-octane fuel and carrying 230,000 rounds of .50 caliber ammunition, along with bombs and rockets for ground attacks. This was just 1 day's worth of operations from a single base, while 3 fighter groups were active at Iwo Jima alone. Supporting this effort was a supply chain reaching back to factories in Detroit, refineries in Texas, and ammunition plants in Missouri, all linked by Liberty ships, produced at a rate of 3 per day, and C-54 Skymaster transport planes that regularly flew cargo routes across the Pacific. Ships arrived at Iwo Jima every day, unloading fuel, ammunition, spare parts, food, mail, and countless other supplies essential for keeping a modern air force running. In contrast, Japanese logistics had descended into chaos and desperation. Aviation fuel was so limited that training flights were cancelled, leaving new pilots to engage in combat without recent flying experience. Ammunition was limited even during combat missions, with pilots instructed to save rounds for only the most certain shots. The Japanese Navy and Army Air Forces, never well coordinated even in optimal conditions, now competed fiercely for dwindling resources like starving dogs fighting over scraps. Aircraft were stripped for spare parts until they were reduced to mere aluminum frames, and entire fighter groups were grounded due to shortages of tires, spark plugs, or hydraulic fluid. Some units tried to make their own spare parts in makeshift workshops, resulting in predictably poor quality. The gap in technological sophistication extended beyond the aircraft to every operational aspect. American pilots wore G-suits that prevented blackouts during high-G maneuvers by redirecting blood to the brain, utilized standardized oxygen systems that worked reliably above 30,000 feet with automatic flow control, and communicated through VHF radios that offered clear reception and multiple channels. Their parachutes were routinely checked and repacked, their life rafts were equipped with operational radios and fresh supplies, and their survival kits contained a range of items from morphine to fishing gear. In contrast, Japanese pilots often flew without working radios. Their vacuum tube radios drained valuable battery life and seldom functioned properly. They relied on unreliable oxygen systems that often failed at altitudes above 20,000 feet, resulting in hypoxia and disorientation, and they lacked G-suits, which would have helped them endure aggressive American maneuvers without losing consciousness or damaging their eyes from broken blood vessels. On June 1, 1945, a day dubbed Black Friday by the Mustang men, it became clear that the greatest threat was not enemy action but rather the limitations of American technology. About 150 Mustangs heading to Osaka encountered a blinding frontal system that weather forecasts had indicated would not be present. In just a few minutes, 27 aircraft were lost, with 24 of those incidents attributed to the weather. Pilots became disoriented in towering cumulus clouds, collided with one another, or simply ran out of fuel while searching for clear air. This tragedy demonstrated that even for the technologically advanced Americans, the extensive long-range missions tested both personnel and equipment to their limits. The weather front reached from sea level to 40,000 feet, featuring severe turbulence, icing conditions, and total lack of visibility. Pilots reported seeing St. Elmo's fire flickering on their wings, compasses spinning aimlessly, and artificial horizons tumbling as their gyroscopes struggled to cope with the chaotic movement. The blow to Japanese morale was devastating and irreversible. Captain Yoshio Yoshida, a prominent pilot with the 47th Sentai who lived through the war, noted in his diary that the sight of American fighters over Tokyo completely shattered their confidence. "We were warned that the B-29s were exposed without protection, that their escort fighters couldn't reach such distances. Now, we see Mustangs flying right over the palace, attacking our airfields in broad daylight and shooting down our top pilots as if they were novices. How can we defend the Emperor when enemy fighters move freely across our sacred homeland?" The sight of those Mustangs with their invasion stripes, so bold and numerous, reveals what our leaders refuse to admit. The war is over, and we are merely waiting for our end. Major Tapp mentioned in a post-war interview that VLR missions tested flying skill. Engaging with Japanese fighter pilots pumped your adrenaline, but traveling from point A to point B was the toughest challenge. The ocean was vast, featureless, and hypnotic. You'd constantly check your compass, questioning whether it was accurate or if you had somehow lost your way. The physical and mental toll was immense and cumulative. Pilots remained strapped into their cockpits for 8 hours or more, unable to stand, stretch, or relieve themselves except through a relief tube that frequently froze at high altitudes. They endured cramping legs that felt like they were being pierced by needles, numb buttocks that left them questioning if they would ever walk again, and the constant stress of flying a single-engine aircraft over vast stretches of empty ocean where a single mechanical failure could lead to almost certain death. The Mustang's cockpit ergonomics, honed through 3 years of combat experience and thousands of pilot reports, proved superior to Japanese designs in every measurable aspect. The P-51D boasted a bubble canopy that offered 360-degree visibility. Pilots could actually look behind them by simply turning their heads, a crucial capability in combat. The seat was fully adjustable to accommodate pilots of varying heights. The rudder pedals were adjustable to fit various leg lengths, and controls were designed to minimize pilot fatigue during extended missions. The instrument panel was logically laid out, placing the most crucial gauges airspeed, altitude, and engine readouts directly in the pilot's view. Although the Ki-84's cockpit was an upgrade from earlier Japanese fighters like the Zero, it still had issues with rear visibility due to structural supports in the fuel tank located behind the pilot's head, along with awkwardly positioned controls that forced pilots to remove their hands from the stick at critical times. Additionally, the instruments were hard to read in combat situations, particularly when experiencing G-forces or when engine vibrations caused everything to shake. Variations in armament often played a key role in combat results, frequently deciding life or death in the split-second skirmishes that defined aerial warfare. The P-51D's .50 caliber machine guns, though they might not seem as impressive as the Ki-84's combination of cannons, offered significant advantages that combat experience had shown to be crucial. The American guns were extremely reliable, with stoppage rates under 1% when properly maintained, a standard thanks to dedicated armament specialists. They could carry much more ammunition, totaling 1,880 to 2,080 rounds compared to the Ki-84's 400 rounds for its cannons and machine guns combined. This allowed American pilots to take ranging shots, engage multiple targets, and not worry about running out of ammunition after just a few seconds of firing. The ballistics of the .50 caliber rounds were well understood, enabling American pilots to reliably hit targets at 400 yards, while Japanese pilots with their mixed cannon and machine gun setups struggled with convergence zones and different ballistic paths. Their cannon rounds fell differently from their machine gun rounds, making precise shooting nearly impossible beyond short distances. The disparity in gunnery training was even more striking. American pilots had fired thousands of rounds during practice, learning to lead targets, estimate ranges, and fire in short bursts to prevent their guns from overheating. They honed their skills on towed sleeves with camera guns and engaged in mock dogfights until deflection shooting became second nature. In 1945, Japanese pilots were fortunate to fire even 100 rounds in training, if that. Ammunition was too valuable to squander on practice when it was essential for combat. Many entered their first battle having never fired their weapons, attempting to master deflection shooting while under attack. The Sunsetter's final aerial combat took place near Tokyo on August 10, 1945, when the 15th and 506th Fighter Groups claimed 7 kills in what would become one of the last air battles of World War II. At this stage, Japanese resistance had diminished to a mere formality, a mere remnant of the powerful force that once dominated the Pacific. Fuel shortages had grounded most Japanese fighters, as their fuel was redirected to support kamikaze missions. The few that did take to the skies were often flown by teenagers with little training, boys who had only recently been in high school. Overall, Iwo's Mustangs were credited with shooting down 206 Japanese planes from April to August 1945, accounting for 75% of the P-51 victories in the Pacific. The actual number was likely higher, as many Japanese aircraft downed over Japan went unconfirmed, their wreckage lost in forests or cities. The strategic consequences reached far beyond just aerial victories, fundamentally altering the course of the entire Pacific War. The presence of P-51s over Japan allowed B-29s to conduct daylight bombing runs with improved accuracy, systematically dismantling Japan's industrial capabilities. Japanese industrial production, already hampered by material shortages and B-29 night raids, came to a standstill due to precise daylight bombing. The psychological impact was just as severe. Japanese civilians witnessed American fighters attacking airfields in broad daylight, targeting trains, and assaulting shipping in Tokyo Bay, clearly demonstrating that Japan had lost control of its own skies. The myth of the divine wind protecting Japan was shattered when American fighters flew over the Imperial Palace itself. Lieutenant Colonel John R. Morgan of the 457th Fighter Squadron carried out several photo reconnaissance missions over Japan in a specially modified P-51D equipped with cameras instead of guns. His findings exposed the extent of the collapse of Japanese aviation. We would fly over airfields that intelligence claimed housed hundreds of aircraft, but we often found only about a dozen planes that could still fly. The others were just abandoned wrecks. No engines, no propellers, some were simply shell stripped for parts. They'd move these wrecks around to create the illusion of having more functioning aircraft for our photo analysts, but we could easily tell a real plane from a hulk. Some airfields even had fake wooden planes with painted markings, attempting to divert our attacks from actual aircraft hidden in protective revetments or camouflaged. The industrial numbers were undeniable and painted a clear picture of the war. The United States manufactured 15,586 P-51s in all variants during the conflict, surpassing Japan's entire output of all aircraft types in 1944 and 1945 combined. Japan produced around 3,500 Ki-84s, but many were destroyed on the ground by B-29 raids and carrier strikes, lost in training accidents due to poor quality control, or grounded due to a lack of parts. American production lines were hitting their peak just as Japanese production was faltering. North American aviation was producing 20 P-51s daily at its height, which surpassed the total number of Ki-84s Japan could produce in a month. Every American aircraft was largely uniform with interchangeable parts, whereas Japanese aircraft exhibited significant variations in quality and performance, even within the same production run. The training pipeline reflected a similar narrative of clear American superiority. By 1945, the United States was training 30,000 pilots each year, with each pilot receiving 200 to 300 hours of flight instruction before moving on to advanced fighter training, followed by another 100 hours of combat training. In contrast, Japan's pilot training program had nearly collapsed, with new pilots getting around 50 hours before being assigned to operational units, often even less. The mathematics of attrition were relentless. America could replace its losses while ensuring quality, whereas Japan struggled to replace its losses even with significantly lowered standards. For every pilot trained by Japan, the US trained 10, and American pilots were much better prepared. Fuel consumption highlighted the strategic outcome clearly. Each P-51 mission from Iwo Jima used about 600 gallons of 100-octane fuel per aircraft, including internal fuel and drop tanks. With 100 aircraft on each mission and operations every day, that totaled 60,000 gallons daily for just one fighter group. American tankers supplied millions of gallons each month to bases in the Pacific, creating a constant flow of fuel. In contrast, Japan was trying to derive aviation fuel from pine roots, needing 200 stumps to produce a single gallon of barely usable fuel, and they were converting training planes into kamikaze weapons due to fuel shortages for regular operations. By August 1945, Japan had fewer than 200,000 gallons of aviation fuel left in the home islands, which was barely enough for one significant operation. The technological revolution represented by the P-51D was more than just impressive performance figures, it encapsulated a whole philosophy of warfare. This aircraft reflected American industrial principles, emphasizing mass production with quality assurance, standardization among manufacturers, and ongoing enhancement driven by combat experience. Each P-51D that came off the assembly line was virtually identical, featuring interchangeable parts and consistent performance. A pilot could enter any P-51D and know precisely how it would handle, as well as the exact location of every switch and gauge. In contrast, Japanese planes, which were increasingly handcrafted with variable quality materials and substitute parts, exhibited significant performance discrepancies even within the same production series. One key model might reach speeds of 400 miles per hour, while another from the same factory could struggle to hit 350 miles per hour due to variations in manufacturing. Brigadier General Ernest M. Moore, the commander of the 7th Fighter Command, later stated, "I have no doubt that the P-51 was the best propeller-driven fighter of World War II. It was our premier air fighter, making it ideal for escort missions and equally effective as the P-47 in attacking ground targets." This evaluation highlighted not only the aircraft's performance but also its reliability, ease of maintenance, and ability to meet the rigorous demands of long-range operations. The P-51 could be refueled and rearmed in just 30 minutes, fly twice a day if necessary, and operate from rough coral runways that would have damaged more fragile aircraft. The maintenance statistics were impressive, showcasing another aspect of American superiority. P-51Ds at Iwo Jima maintained an operational rate exceeding 80%, despite challenging conditions like volcanic dust, corrosive salt air, and limited facilities that forced most maintenance to be done outdoors. Ground crews could change engines in 4 hours with the help of mobile cranes and standardized procedures, while battle damage that would keep a Japanese fighter grounded for weeks could be fixed overnight using prefabricated parts shipped in from the US. The Ki-84, despite having fuel and ammunition available, often faced serviceability rates below 40%, occasionally dropping to as low as 20%. The intricate HUMMAR engine needed specialized tools that were frequently unavailable, skilled technicians who were largely deceased or assigned to combat units, and spare parts that had to be custom-fitted due to poor manufacturing tolerances. Weather reconnaissance offered another vital edge that saved countless American lives. Dedicated B-29s conducted weather missions hours before fighter operations, providing updates on cloud conditions, wind speeds, and frontal systems. These weather birds offered comprehensive meteorological insights that assisted in planning routes to avoid the worst weather conditions. However, as Black Friday illustrated, even the most prepared missions could still be caught off guard by the weather. Japanese forces, without such resources, often flew into conditions that decimated entire units. Meanwhile, the American capability to forecast and circumvent weather fronts significantly decreased operational losses, whereas Japanese forces faced devastating weather-related casualties that outstripped their combat losses. The communication systems underpinning American operations were groundbreaking for that era. High-frequency radio beacons relayed information from submarines and island bases, while submarine-based rescue coordination directed search aircraft to downed pilots, and real-time weather updates established a safety network that empowered pilots to maximize their aircraft's extended range. The psychological comfort of knowing that someone would search for you if you went down is hard to quantify. Japanese pilots, often flying without a functioning radio and no chance of rescue if they had to land, approached each mission with a resigned acceptance of likely death. Their farewell ceremonies before missions were serious, as they anticipated never coming back. Captain Harry C. Crean Jr. of the 531st Fighter Squadron, who would later become an ace over Japan with 7 victories, recognized the strategic situation with stark honesty. "We controlled the skies above Japan. We could go wherever we wanted, whenever we wanted. The Japanese were aware of this, we were aware of it, and most importantly, Japanese civilians understood it too. Every P-51 flying over Tokyo was evidence that Japan had lost the war. We were no longer fighting for air superiority. We already had it. We were merely showcasing it, rubbing it in their faces, and demonstrating that any resistance was pointless." The extended long-range missions significantly altered the strategic landscape in the Pacific, making all previous assessments irrelevant. Japan could no longer depend on distance to safeguard the home islands, a protective barrier that had served them well for centuries. The industrial core, which had remained largely unscathed during 3 years of conflict, was now vulnerable to daily assaults. The sight of American fighters over Tokyo shattered any remaining illusions about Japan's defensive capabilities, dispelled the myth of the divine wind, and underscored that defeat was not merely possible but unavoidable. The human toll starkly illustrated the technological gap in harsh numerical terms. Between July 1 and August 15, 1945, a total of 85 American fighter pilots lost their lives on VLR missions, yet only a few, perhaps 5 or 6, were due to air-to-air combat. The majority of losses were operational, resulting from mechanical failures, navigation mistakes, or sheer fatigue leading pilots to make critical errors. During that same time frame, Japan suffered pilot losses in the hundreds, possibly exceeding 1,000, with entire squadrons wiped out in desperate attempts to intercept American forces. The 47th Sentai, which began April with 40 active pilots, had dwindled to just 3 by August. The 244th Sentai was completely annihilated, reformed with new pilots, and then met the same fate. The final dogfights over Japan showcased the complete disintegration of Japanese air power as a cohesive entity. On August 14, 1945, August 15 in Japan, due to the international dateline, Lieutenant Jerry Yellin undertook what would be the last combat mission of the war. Taking off from Iwo Jima with his wingman, 19-year-old Second Lieutenant Philip Schlamberg, they targeted airfields near Nagoya. The mission had been scheduled before the news of Japan's surrender reached them, and the code word Utah, which would have recalled them, never made it to their radios. Yellin and Schlamberg attacked their targets before heading home, weaving into a cloud formation to dodge anti-aircraft fire. When Yellin finally broke through the clouds, Schlamberg was missing, shot down by ground fire, marking the last American combat death of World War II. Even as the war was coming to an end, with the Emperor's surrender broadcast already recorded, Japanese anti-aircraft positions continued to fire with desperate resolve. However, Japanese fighters were noticeably absent, having essentially been rendered ineffective due to fuel shortages, a lack of pilots, or outright destruction. The outcome of the air war was indisputable, etched in metal and blood across Japan's skies. The P-51D Mustang, capable of reaching a top speed of 440 miles per hour and boasting a range of 2,000 miles with drop tanks and 6 reliable machine guns holding nearly 2,000 rounds, had left the Japanese home islands vulnerable to daylight air assaults. The Ki-84 Hayate, despite its potential and the bravery of its pilots, lacked the numbers, reliability, and skill needed for a successful defense. It was not a fair fight but rather a predetermined outcome, influenced as much by factories in Detroit and oil fields in Texas as by battles over Tokyo. The impressive American industrial power, embodied in the P-51 Mustang, accomplished what naval blockades and island hopping could not, completely erasing Japan's ability to protect its airspace. The B-29s that dropped atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki flew without fighter support, not due to a lack of available escorts, but because they were unnecessary. Japanese fighter resistance had been eliminated from the skies, overwhelmed by the clear superiority of American technology, training, and production. Of the 3,514 Ki-84s produced, only one remains today. Housed in the Chiran Peace Museum in Kagoshima, Japan, it stands as a solitary reminder of Japan's struggle to keep up with American technological prowess. In contrast, hundreds of P-51 Mustangs remain in museums and private collections across the globe, with many still performing at airshows, their Merlin engines echoing the story of American industrial success 7 decades after they first flew over Tokyo. The difference in the number of surviving aircraft tells its own tale. American planes were built to endure, carefully maintained, and cherished as historical treasures. Japanese planes were designed for immediate action, expected to be lost in battle, and regarded as disposable. The shock felt by Japanese pilots facing P-51 Mustangs over Tokyo was not just tactical surprise, it was the jarring realization that American industrial strength and technological progress had turned what once seemed impossible into the ordinary. Single-engine fighters completing 1,500-mile combat missions, arriving with enough fuel for 2 hours of engagement, and safely returning to base was unimaginable for the Japanese. The P-51D Mustang soaring over Mount Fuji was more than just a plane. It symbolized American industrial might, technological progress, and the relentless calculus of total war. The message was stark and harsh. In contemporary industrial combat, superior technology multiplied by high-volume production leads to victory. The P-51D Mustang epitomized American manufacturing at its finest, with over 15,000 aircraft built to consistent standards, flown by skilled pilots, backed by limitless logistics, and deployed with tactical precision. In contrast, Japan's Ki-84 Hayate, despite acts of bravery and some tactical achievements, had no hope. The appearance of American fighters over Tokyo represented the stark reality of mathematical supremacy. Bravery alone cannot defeat the calculations of industrial production, technological progress, and logistical dominance. The P-51D Mustang soaring over Tokyo symbolized the end of the samurai era, giving way to the age of assembly lines, superchargers, and long-range fighter escorts. The divine wind was subdued by science, the warrior spirit vanquished by industrial power, and the empire of the rising sun eclipsed by aluminum wings and steel engines.